Andy, welcome to the RTÉ Rugby podcast. After European action from the weekend, Munster fall to Toulouse, Leinster win without having to play rugby, and the show goes on this weekend. Plenty to talk about. I'm delighted to be joined by Donal Lenihan, Jackman, Liddy and Fiona Coghlan this weekend as the Irish Women's Six Nations campaign launches on Saturday away to Wales. Look, guys, you're all very welcome. Donal, I guess we'll start off with Munster on Saturday. It's a funny one. Look, you know, we all had our view last week about the manner in which they lost to Leinster in the Pro 14. And yet they went out on Saturday, and I thought they played really, really well, Donal, but just succumbed to a very strong Toulouse side who emptied the bench and scored 2 late tries to perhaps flatter them on the scoreline. Disappointing for Munster, but I guess the better side won on the day.
Yeah, no question about that. I agree with you. I mean, I was lucky enough to be there. It's actually, you know, while it's hugely disappointing on those big European days to have nobody there, and ironically, Munster and all of you have been in Thomond Park for the big European days. You'll know how Munster, they sign off their warm up by starting a half lap of the field on the far side as they work their way over towards the dressing room. And the crowd just really, that's the last signal to the crowd that they're going into the dressing room. The place becomes alive. To see them do that in absolute silence, it kind of, you know, put everything into context. That said, I thought it was a really good game, but you were left scratching your head as to where was the performance 7 days earlier when it was really needed. So from that point of view, it was quite frustrating. Toulouse, you know, they're so talented, even though they were short a number of first choice players. The thing for me, and I think it's something just watching over the course of the whole weekend, you watch all the French sides, their ability to play out of the tackle, their offloading, the skill levels. And it isn't just the backs. I mean, there was one passage of play for Toulouse when Cyril Boy, Julien Marchand, what a hooker he is, a cross in the back row, and Joe Tukori when he came on. Just massive men, but incredibly soft hands and the ability to play other players through the hole. I mean, that for me was the highlight of the game. They're just a very skillful side. And to be fair, I think they're a bit more resilience about them than certainly the Toulouse teams that arrived. They got hockeyed in 2 quarterfinals in a row in Thomond Park. I mean, the bottom line, every time Munster scored, they came back and scored either 3 or 5 points within 3 or 4 minutes. And that showed their class, even though I'm not overly convinced that they're quite good enough yet to go on and win the tournament. They'll be there or thereabouts. I think they'll get to the semi-final. But, you know, I suppose when you get to that stage of this competition, the margin between the teams is very little. So overall, I thought, brilliant game. Pity there was nobody there to watch it. But, you know, frustrating in that at least, you know, if Leinster had beaten Munster the previous week with Munster playing at that level, so be it.
Yeah, and I don't think many people, Bernard, saw the Munster performance coming, because they did play really well for large parts of the game. I think just the strength and depth that Toulouse had in the end took its toll on Munster. I guess the impact that the Toulouse bench had versus the impact that the Munster bench had as well. And it's a kind of a bit of a head scratcher because they were so poor the previous weekend and then they go out and played pretty well, albeit on the losing end of the scoreboard as well. So it's a bit of a strange one.
Yeah, it is. But I think Toulouse defense isn't as anywhere near as strong as Leinster is or Exeter to that matter. They're very good with the ball, and I think Munster certainly exposed them early, and it was good to see Munster, you know, playing with a little bit more ambition, playing with more speed. Having said that, I thought they went back to type a little bit in the second half, and I think, you know, Toulouse have an extra gear that Munster just don't have at the moment. And I would agree with Donal. I think Toulouse, I wouldn't have them in the top 3 in terms of likely winners. You know, for me, it's Racing, Exeter, Leinster, but they are a very, very strong side.
Is that based on their defence mostly, Birch?
Yeah, just they concede points too easily, you know, and they drift in and out of games. The previous week against Montpellier, I look back at it and, okay, it was a week before a Champions Cup game, but yeah, there's definitely concentration issues there with them. So yeah, look, it was a phenomenal game. Toulouse are a joy to watch. In fairness, that's something you couldn't hold against them. And for me, the biggest thing about the weekend was how attacking rugby is back. You know, defence coaches must be tearing their hair out because, you know, the lowest scoring game of the weekend was La Rochelle Gloucester on Friday night, which was 43 points. And that felt like an open game. The rest of the game, Scarlet 71 points, Bordeaux 53, Racing 56, Exeter 73. Like, really good attacking rugby. And it shows that the trend of the game now, a year ago, was the team who kicks most wins. Certainly at European level, we'll see if it's valid for international level. European level, playing with ambition, keeping the ball alive, seems to be the way forward. And probably maybe in Ireland we're a little bit behind the curve there. The French seem to have grasped this a little bit earlier than we have. Now we'll see. Leinster didn't play, so it's hard to judge them. And certainly the way they played against Munster, the first half, you would have thought, you know, they have the tools to do that. But that's a good thing from a rugby fan point of view, that attacking rugby's back in vogue. And maybe these law changes around the breakdown have actually worked. You know, it took a while, but now it pays to keep the ball in hand.
There you go, Wes. That solves the problem. So, like, forget this 50-20-20 rule or changing the laws around the breakdown. Sack all the defence coaches now, and rugby union is saved. What do you reckon?
Yeah, it does definitely seem to have taken a little twist in certainly in the last few months, in terms of the attacking game becoming prioritised again. I mean, I'd agree with the lads on both Munster and Toulouse in terms of, like, it almost highlights Munster's performance last week against Leinster for me, and that you kind of just question where exactly was their head at, just in terms of the intent they came out to play with. I did hear from a few people I was speaking to that they went away from a lot of what they had been doing throughout the season in the lead up to Leinster, and almost tried to come up with something new specifically for Leinster, whereas they kind of went back to what had worked for them throughout the Pro 14 season in the lead up to this game. So I think that alone kind of points to Leinster being occupying a strong place in their head. But Toulouse, I think they've rediscovered themselves from back in the day, and in the bad ways as well as the good, and that I find them incredibly infuriating at times, because there's so much individual talent that you kind of be saying, geez, if you were just 2% more pragmatic at times, you'd be unbeatable. And you would think players like Kaino and Farmina and that, like, as brilliant a player as Kaino's been, you would think at 38 guys like that are maybe going to get caught for legs or for lungs by a team like Leinster before the season is out. But just like to be the 500th person to comment on it, just think DuPont is just fascinating to watch at the minute, even when he's not that effective. I was saying to Birch the weekend, like, I can't think of any player who has a strike rate for try scoring like him since, I don't know, maybe Joe Rokocoko, maybe Lomu before that. But I mean, it's like, he's 84 kilos. His power and ability to stand up and a tackle, play the ball off, is just incredible. Like, it almost defies physics. And just watching him and how alert he is, how he's able to improvise on the hoof. Like, I almost wonder, do teams need to start man marking these support lines of his? Do you designate a player to pick up his trail runs? Because it's just like every game he's doing it. It's just incredible to watch. I think he's destined to be the best player in the world, one of the best players in the world for a long time to come.
If he isn't already, Fiona, I have to say, like, watching him in the flesh there and watching the lines that he runs, you know, first of all, his work level is just off the scale. He never stops, you know, never stops. And what fascinated me as well was the amount of work that he does that doesn't end up with him getting the ball is just amazing. And there probably isn't a better player in the world right now than Antoine Dupont.
Yeah, he's phenomenal, and it's been consistent for the last 2 years as well, whether it be at international level or back with club. And I love the fact that he's so small and he's still standing up against these bigger players, and he's shown them up. And I've no doubt that teams try to mark him out of the game, but he's just that good that he finds those positions and those trail lines. You know, he just comes from nowhere and he's consistently there. And he's 23, so he's so many years to come. And how much better can he even get again with even more game time and those players around him? But it's his ability to bring other players into the game as well, as a scrum half. And as you said, his consistently throughout the game, his tempo, to keep going. Yeah, he's phenomenal.
He's brilliant. And Donald, just before we move on from Toulouse, and we will in a second, Ntomac at fly half as well just really caught the eye. A couple of high balls that he took, dropping back into the pocket where Munster kicked the ball. Toulouse obviously had marshalled the fact that Conor Murray would kick the ball an awful lot, and he did. And the kicks weren't bad, actually. Conor Murray had quite a good game, I thought. But Ntomac alongside Dupont, France have the makings of probably one of the best halfback combinations potentially in the world for the next 2 years with those two guys.
Yeah, there's no doubt about that. And, they've invested a huge amount in it. They put them together 2 years ago now, and they're still comparatively young. They put them together as a halfback pairing for France before Toulouse had faith enough in Ntomac to play him at 10. They played him a lot at 12 and Zach Holmes at 10 during that period. But I tell you what it highlighted for me on Saturday, being there, was just how good a rugby player Ntomac is. As you highlighted, I mean, I think he's obviously played in midfield for Toulouse. You could play him at full back, no question about that. His aerial ability was brilliant. But not only that, I think his capacity to identify space early, he's brilliant feet, and he's actually incredibly pacey. Now, saying all that, there's a debate. Is he the best number 10 in France? I mean, Mathieu Jalabert, I think, who got his opportunity when Ntomac was out of the opening games in the Six Nations, I thought grasped it with both hands. And if both were available, I would be thinking maybe they'd be going more towards Jalabert. But, that's a great problem for the French to have. The other player I want to mention when you're talking about world-class, X-Factor, and again, maybe it's because there's nobody in the stadium and you can hear everything. But, again, watching Cheslin Colby up close, he's a phenomenal player. Now, we would have seen him in the World Cup for South Africa. You're not quite as close to the action, in the big stadium out there as we were last weekend. He's actually way stronger than you think. A bit like Dupont, he's incredibly strong upper body. He's big thighs in him, but it's just his feet. I mean, early on, he had a one-on-one with Gavin Coombs. Yeah. And he just left him for dead. Coombs, it was almost as if he had an invisible switch, and Coombs was left there with his hands out, wondering where did he go to. Yeah. He did the same to Keith Earls. Then, when Maxime Medard ran out of petrol, they put him back at full back, and he was actually more effective as a broken field runner. I mean, you daredn't kick to him. He was the guy who gave the scoring pass for Lebel. The trailing pass inside. So, I mean, they're just two X-Factor players that they have in their backline. They're just, star quality, well worth being able to see these guys in the flesh. And ironically, as Fiona said, Colby is probably the same size as Dupont. So two of the most effective players on the field were probably the two smallest guys.
Yeah, absolutely. And just in terms of the French clubs, Birch, I don't think we've had as many French clubs in the knockout stages this round. I know it's a different season. We had last 16 in the quarterfinals, but certainly French club rugby seems to be on an upward curve. Is that your reading of it?
Oh, massively, yeah. They've solved so many issues. We've spoken about it a little bit in terms of how it's affected the national team, but realistically, it's come from bottom up, and now it's going back from top down. And clubs like Bordeaux, beating Bristol is no mean feat, and they won quite convincingly, 36-17, full of young French players who some are playing for France, some will go on to play for France, and then topped up with some seasoned foreign players, guys like Scott Higginbottom, for example, just holding the team together, giving them experience. And as Wesley mentioned, like Kino, I mean, it's amazing how some of these French clubs have been able to get top end world class players like Kino, still fit, performing. Joe Takori is 38. Think back to the Toulon team with Bakis Bota and Simon Shaw, etc. They seem to manage them well and really be able to hold on to that experience. But now the beauty of it is they're actually not surrounding them by more old foreign players. They're surrounding them by young French players who have no fear. And they're in a very strong place. La Rochelle looked great. It looked like they had the easy side of the draw and a Sale on Sunday. The way they put away Scarlets, they look like they're pretty strong. it's there's a lot of strength and depth there, and in the Challenge Cup as well. So look, at French rugby's got their act together, and we all said when they do, it'll be ominous for everyone else. So let's see if we can catch up again.
I just want to have you on this. Do you have any sympathy for Toulon on Friday night, Birch, with the manner in which the game was cancelled? They had a player test positive in the squad. He didn't travel. The squad came over. They were all tested on Thursday. All came back negative. But because they were deemed to be close contacts of a front row player who was the original positive test, the game, at the behest of the Irish government, we should say, was called off. Do you have sympathy for Toulon? They're not happy about this at all. And they're actually threatening now that they might not compete in Europe again. I don't know how seriously we can take that. But do you have any sympathy for them?
I do have sympathy for them. I think, and I'd have sympathy for any club, who loses a place in Europe based around a COVID outbreak. And, it's unfortunate, but every club is on tender hooks, and it could be Leinster this week, it could be Clermont next week. It's just that's the way it is. And I think realistically, I would have said ERC probably should have got the medical people together on Thursday. I think that's Toulon's biggest issue, is that they were allowed travel, and effectively then they were pulled the day of the game. In hindsight, great, but I think they could have made that call once they knew it was a front row player, and once they ascertained that there was close contacts. They were never going to be able to find 4 or 5 new front rows who were qualified, fit, and eligible. So I think the decision should have been made the day before. But look, to give the ERC some credit, they're finding their feet at this as well, and it's everybody's crisis management on the hoof, and it's unfortunate. But look, I don't think they did. Sergio Prise wanted the other French players to go on strike and not play the weekend. That didn't get here. And look, I think the Toulon president, he'll calm down. I mean, you can't fight this. This is a great competition, and it's very unfortunate. But I think it's something that's just part of the environment at the moment. And yeah, they'll get over it and they'll move on.
Yeah, but the alternative ways is that we don't have a competition. I mean, if and the greater good is that sometimes teams, because of the pandemic and because of the situation we find themselves, are going to be inconvenienced. Seriously, in this case, in the case of Toulon, but it's that, and we have these rules in place, or the competition does not go ahead. So it's pretty.
Yeah, I mean, in fairness though, I think the problem was that there was stuff left open for interpretation on at a couple of different junctures. First of all, they could have called it on Wednesday as soon as the case was there. Don't travel. Game's not happening. Second of all, they then offered to play on the Sunday, providing they brought in 6 new front rows. But at that point, you would have passed this 3-day incubation period. So surely if you tested everyone again on Sunday and everyone was negative for a second time, maybe the need for the 6 new front rows isn't there. So I think, look, there's got to be plenty of people with scientific reasonings why the game shouldn't have been played, and they're possibly right. But I think just leaving that wiggle room and kind of turning it into an open forum was a mistake on the competition organisers' behalf. And perhaps it hints at, Toulon as one of the more vocal L&R clubs when the tournament was kind of restructured a couple of years ago. It probably shows the hesitancy EPCR have in kind of handing down a veto on these things, and then the way that's exploited. And as Bart said, it is a brilliant competition, but it's always going to be, I don't know, there's always going to be a little hesitancy towards it, while you have the feeling teams aren't treating it with 100% respect.
But it's good, isn't it good? It's good from a French perspective that the French clubs are doing well now, and we have 5 in the quarterfinals this weekend? Because I always get the feeling, this is what I think you're maybe scratching at here, is that the French clubs don't take it as seriously as perhaps the Irish provinces do, where Europe is the be all and end all. But maybe French success towards the latter stages will kick into gear, I guess, more of an affinity with the competition, more of a kind of a grow for the competition among the French sides, which we need. We need that.
You'd hope it would, but I mean, it's like that could be the French success could be down to the fact that there's no crowds in stadiums. When you consider how poor they are traveling at times, that could be a contributing factor. But equally, there does seem to be this generation of players, and not just the guys we've seen in the Six Nations, is the thing that struck me over the weekend. If you look at Jordan Joseph with Racing. You look at Lebel with Toulouse. You know, you look at guys like Macalau with Stade Francais, who we all saw a couple of years ago playing under 20s. You kind of look at these fellas and go, geez, how are they not in the French team every week? So there seems another layer of talent even beneath what they've exposed in this year and last year's Six Nations, which is incredible, really.
I wouldn't be overly confident Leinster are going to beat Exeter this weekend, Fiona, honestly.
No, and it's going to be hard to tell where they're at. Some ways you think, would that weekend rest do them good in the sense of Sexton will be back to full fitness and the likes of that, but Exeter are bloody good, and you could see particularly when they got into the 22 that they were relentless, pretty similar to the likes of Leinster as well, and it'll definitely be a huge battle from up front and to put Leinster, give them a good platform going forward. But yeah, like Lyon got off to a good start. I think they were 14-0 up, and then Exeter had to claw themselves back into the game. But it was certainly the forwards, like the likes of Hill and Ewers and stuff, that took control of that game and put Exeter into a really good position. And you know, they've got quality players at the back as well, the likes of Flaherty and stuff, if they can get the ball. So it's not going to be easy. And you look at Leinster squad, they have a huge number of players injured. I know their back row, they've an embarrassment of riches, but like they've 5 back row players out injured. Gary Ringrose is still a huge loss at 13. Whether O'Loughlin can fill that sufficiently enough against the likes of Exeter and going forward, I'm not sure. So they'll certainly be up against it.
Just in terms of the picture of Europe as well, Donald, and we'll come back to Leinster in a minute. I was listening to Rassie Rasmus here, and I'm just trying to kind of structure this question in the way that I want it. But I was listening to Rassie Rasmus speak during the week. He was on News Talk a couple of different occasions. He was quoted in newspapers as well about what he feels is the need for Ireland to develop players from within, to promote our own players. It goes back to the signing that we talked about that Munster made last week for South African imports coming in to maybe fill places that potentially could go to Irish players. And I'm looking at the layout this weekend, and Leinster are the sole Irish survivors in the quarterfinals of the Champions Cup. Connacht were beaten in the Challenge Cup, obviously, as well. They're gone, Munster are out. And I just wonder, is the picture that we're looking at this weekend, 5 French clubs, a couple of English, but Leinster sole survivors from Ireland, is that a reflection of where Irish rugby is at the moment? And like, I don't want to be too general about it, and obviously, you know, you can argue both sides of the coin here, but I just kind of wonder, really, is the kind of upper hand in club rugby now, the power switching towards France predominantly, with maybe English clubs getting stronger, and is this actually where Ireland is at the moment, do you think?
Yeah, I think it is. The simple answer to it, look, these things go in swings and roundabouts. I think you go back to maybe 3 or 4 years ago, was there 5 teams from the Pro 14 were in Europe? There was only, I think, 1 English team at one stage, and you had 2 or 3 French. I think what we're seeing this season, and Jerry Flannery was quoted widely saying it, look, but I think we've been watching the Pro 14 assiduously over the past number of months. The quality of the Pro 14 this season was rubbish. Let's be honest about it. Some of the games were a waste of time. Great to see some of our younger players getting exposed, but really they weren't tested to any great degree. So that, you know, when you ask them then to get up to the next level, and Europe, there is no comparison, certainly this season, the gulf in class between playing some of the Pro 14 games and then jumping into what we're getting at European level is chalk and cheese. No comparison whatsoever. I think it is no coincidence that the French have risen. You know, we've been talking about the mission that Bernard Laporte has been on. Once France got the World Cup in 2023, everything has been geared towards working towards a French team capable of winning that. For that to happen, they've started down at I won't say the grassroots, but they've gone down to Pro 14, and Bernard would be more expert on this than me, but they've changed the ground rules as to who you can have in your match day 23, with the emphasis on getting less overseas players and more French-based players in that squad. You're seeing the benefit of that now. I mean, like, of the 5 teams that are left in Europe, and you know, I do have sympathy for Toulon. Having said that, I think Leinster would have beaten them. So, you know, if you're being cruel about it, I don't think you're losing a team that were good enough to go on and win the Champions Cup. And I think we have to be cognizant of, look, as it could, if what happened to Toulon happened to Leinster, we'd all be up in arms over it. Because, and as well, obviously, they're a potential winner of the tournament. But if France were restricted to just picking their national team out of the 5 French teams that are in the quarterfinals of the Champions Cup, they'd have some team. And the strength and depth that they are building, because a lot of those French players now are getting the opportunity that where they may have been blocked by overseas players 3 and 4 years ago. I mean, just going back to Toulouse, they brought in Thibault Flamand and Alban Placines off the bench. I hadn't heard of these guys before, but they were outstanding, the second row and a back row. So they have these fellas crawling out of the ground everywhere. So just at this point in time, I think French rugby is on a high. You can see there's a confidence there maybe that hasn't been there before. I think there's also, finally, they've embraced things like conditioning and nutrition, whereas they may have been a bit laissez-faire towards that before. They are now embracing all the things that everybody else maybe had an advantage over them in the past number of years. So I think we're seeing the benefit of that. And look, I think they're just fantastic to watch. So if that's the standard that everybody else has to rise to, then brilliant, because they will. It'll be a rising tide and everybody will benefit.
I was watching Gavin Coombs an awful lot as well on Saturday, Birch, and then after the game, talking to a couple of lads on the way home who made the point, why don't Munster just, take someone like him who clearly has it, build a squad around the likes of him, maybe, Craig Casey coming through, a few other young players that we mentioned last weekend as well, and let that be the kind of the new approach that Munster should take here, rather than kind of signing this. I know we talked about this last weekend, but I thought watching Gavin Coombs play as well as he did last week, and how very little impact the Munster bench had, and no disrespect to JJ Hanrahan, who's gone, and obviously Billy Holland, who's at the end of his career, and a couple of others as well, but there needs to be a new wave of young talent coming through, and young talent that gets a chance each week to actually play and develop their game so that they will be good enough at the very top level.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, we've highlighted there's a batch of young fellas there that have done everything that's asked of them. Now, a lot of them haven't had the opportunity to play, in knockout stages of Europe or Pro 14 finals, which Coombs has, and Coombs has shown that he definitely looks like he has the ability to be a key member of Munster starting team for big games going forward. The reality is they need to find 3 or 4 more of those. That's the reality. I mean, obviously, then you have RG Snyman coming back next year. He's going to add to it. Joey having a lot more games will be a bonus, but they do need to find 3 or 4 more players, and they're not going to be able to go out and recruit them from elsewhere. And I don't think that's the right thing to do. I think Munster needs to keep its identity. In actual fact, maybe need to double down on their identity a little bit and find homegrown players who can come in and make an impact that the likes of Coombs has, and Casey. Sorry, he's another fellow who has stepped up and shown he can play in big games. Obviously, got cap for Ireland, but there's probably another batch underneath this that they need to come through and give them depth, because it's as Donal mentioned. Toulouse were able to bring players off the bench who aren't household names, who aren't internationals, but could start, for other teams in this competition. And you wouldn't.
Important to note, though, Birch, that Toulouse were inspired by their preparation in Tom Clifford Park on Friday afternoon. And several of the players have mentioned since.
They did credit the pre-match training to captain's run as part of their build-up. But look, again, I would think, just to go back to Donal's point, the reason you're seeing so many young French players now is obviously they cut down the number of foreign players, but also you get rewarded financially for producing a foreign player. So if you can bring a player through your academy into your senior team, you get more money back every time he plays from the federation. So he's worth more to you than a standard French player. Plus, if he moves club, so like Grenoble, we got nearly €1 million selling players when we needed money to. Selling players who came from our academy, and the longer they've been in your academy and the more first team games they've played for you, the more their value is if another club signs them. So, and it's not if they're out of contract. Effectively, if you sign a young French player from another club, you got to pay the premium. So that's how they've done it. Now, Ireland's model is a little bit different, but we still should be very much geared towards, we need to find a way to make it attractive for the 4 head coaches. Now, Leo does it anyway, but the head coaches to not be completely obsessed about the short-term results, but to be able to blood those young players. Because with 4 teams, you know, you look at France, as Donal said, you could pick a great French team for those 5 teams, but there's another 9 out there plus a Pro D2. So we are limited a little bit in terms of, you know, how many teams we pick from. So there has to be some kind of an incentive to bring through young players, and you could say that, you know, and that's something that Newsford and RFU need to work out. But
the Irish system as well, Bert, isn't it quite restrictive even in and of itself? If you have, say, 20 centrally contracted players, IRFU contracted players around Ireland, I mean, the head coaches are nearly almost obliged to pick them, because these are the guys earning the top salary, and even the Irish coach is almost obliged to pick these guys, taking all the top money, taking all the big salaries, and sometimes irrespective of form or how actually well they're playing, they're going to get picked because, well, goddamn, we're paying them all this money, so put them out there and let them play.
You know, that's the risk when you go down the central contract route. You just got to make sure your decisions are more right than wrong in terms of picking someone who's definitely a step above the competitors. I don't think the system's that bad. I just think maybe sometimes it's a very safe system. So IRFU funding is great. You know, no one's going to go bankrupt, which is brilliant. But it's not a real market. It's not competitive market, because everyone wants to stay here. All the players want to stay here, and you don't get that natural. So Jerome Cahill leaving New Zealand, 4 years ago. John O'Foe leaving, New Zealand 10 years ago, opened up an opportunity for someone else. Where we kind of, there's no real exit point for us. It's very, it's very stable, which is great, but it makes it hard for those young players to get through.
Is the system out of date?
Sorry, Hugh, can I just make one point on that in terms of, like, the system? It looks great and all that, but just on the Gavin Coombs point, I would have seen Gavin Coombs play maybe 3 times for young Munsters in the All-Ireland League. And you could see he was a big lad. He had talent. There was no question. But I have to say, he didn't stand out for me in the games that I saw. If I was asked maybe 2 years ago when I saw him play in those games, would he have the impact that he has had for Munster? I would have said no. Whereas, you know, some of these guys, the minute I saw Ryan Baird play twice for Trinity about 2 years ago, and the minute I saw him, I said, oh, geez, this guy, destined for the big time, definitely has it. Coombs didn't impact me on this, or Coombs didn't impact me on the same way. So what has happened? He has been exposed to a lot of regular rugby, a lot of quality rugby, I should say. And he's got a run of games, he's got a number of games. And because he had sort of good basic talent, he's taken off. But I think we have a lot of players in that category who never get that consistent run of games. They get one, then they don't play for 3 or 4 weeks. Then they're struggling because they haven't played. They try too hard. Then they get dropped into a Munster team that maybe 7 or 8 of the better players are missing. Whereas Coombs has been lucky. A lot of the games he's had has been in the stronger side. And his growth and his development in the last 12 months has been phenomenal. And I think there are players in that layer underneath him that if they were given that same consistency, that they could make that leap just as easily. Like Jack Crowley is one of them who, just unfortunately, because of the pandemic, these young fellas have had no rugby in the last 12 months. I think he's a guy, if he got 7 or 8 games in a row, he could really jump up to the next level. And Coombs, for me, is the ultimate example of that.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I guess the system overall, as Bert says, like, it ticks an awful lot of boxes. It's very safe. Nobody's going to go bankrupt and all that. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the system is working or that it's fit for purpose in terms of getting the maximum return of what we have here, which is 4 professional sides. A lot of players trying to fit into that. And ultimately, you know, each of those provinces trying to fit into the Irish team.
Well, I was actually talking to Birch about this over the weekend, but like, certainly in the Munster one, if you go back to what Donal was saying, it's a little clearer in other places. But like, as far as I know, and Birch will know a bit better, Guy Easterby handles contracts and recruitment and retention in Leinster. I think Johnny Petrie does it in Ulster. Gareth Fitzgerald certainly used to do it in Munster. I don't think the new CEO in Munster necessarily, that is maybe part of his mandate first and foremost. So you kind of straight away with Munster, like obviously with this talk of Stephen Larkham last night, potentially leaving, and obviously Rog was talked about a lot over the weekend. But I mean, to me, it almost seems like the recruitment and retention, and also like the flow of players into the academy prior to academy age, and the flow of players from academy into the senior squad, married up with that recruitment and retention role, so that you can create this certainly medium to potentially long-term holistic kind of succession plan. It's kind of almost mind-blowing that that's not in place, really. And I would nearly think a position like that, you want to call it a director of rugby, but it's nearly a director of rugby operations, and that it's not just solely to do with the first team. I would actually think that's a more pressing concern than any of the first team coaches or some of the tactical issues we've talked about around the first team. I would think in the medium term, getting that kind of joined up thinking across these different strands of the organization is actually, I would say, the most pressing thing to address.
Within the provinces? Certainly
within Munster anyway, when we've been talking about their relative malaise over the last few weeks.
Maybe
a little more defined in the other provinces.
Fiona, maybe more so Munster really at the moment, just by virtue of the situation that they find themselves in. Leinster, have this feeder system that works very well, and certainly you're looking at the Leinster squad and you're thinking there's nothing needs to be done there. It seems to be working very well for them, but they're unique in the country in that they have this school system flowing into the academy system, flowing into the senior squad that Munster doesn't have, that Ulster certainly doesn't have to the same degree, and that Connacht doesn't have as well. So it's not really a Leinster issue at the moment, it's the rest of the country.
No, but I think you could potentially use Leinster as some sort of model, taking out the school systems. Like they've branched out further than the school systems, and you have players coming through the clubs. And then when they're brought into the academy, they're brought into senior training. Lancaster's down training with them, and they're brought in. So that progression just keeps coming through. Like they're not just brought in if someone's injured, they're consistently brought in for training and things like that. So the standard's higher. I think a lot depends on the academies and where the feeders are coming from the academies. So yeah, Leinster have the schools and the clubs. Down in Munster, it's not so clear, or Ulster. Well, I do think Ulster have developed some of their key back players from their academy. Their forwards probably haven't stepped forward in the manner that they would have hoped. And then Connacht kind of taken more from other provinces, which is fine. I think that movement of players within the provinces is fine once the identity of each of the provinces isn't lost. But yeah, I think Wes hit it on the head there. Having some sort of director of rugby long-term role as opposed to the coaches having to oversee it, I think would be important going forward. That they're looking 5-10 years down the line as opposed to just Champions Cup this year.
Because coaching by its very nature is very short-term driven. It's results business. Andy Farrell is the same. I mean, you saw it in the Six Nations as well. He went all out to beat Italy because he had to beat Italy, right? I mean, that's their primary focus is the next game.
He would expect then players to be ready to step up to the squad as he would need them, because they should have come through that in the academy. And I just don't see that overall picture happening in a lot of the provinces that we see in Leinster. But I think it's just organically grown in Leinster as opposed to anyone having a specific role to oversee it. But then you can look back at like development officers in certain areas. You can go right down to grassroots where these players are coming from. Obviously, West Cork have done a huge amount over the years. But obviously that needs to spread out amongst the whole province, and ensuring the right people and numbers on the ground is really important.
What do you think, Birch?
Yeah, I don't think it's grown organically in Leinster, but I think it's too easy to say they have the private schools and they have the population, etc. And I agree that is part of it. But if you look at their CEO is the most experienced CEO in Irish rugby, so he's been there since the start of professionalism. So that's a great help. He knows the business inside out. He's been dealing with the IRFU and he's been dealing with ERC and Pro 14 for the last 20 years. They've brought in Guy Easterby in a position where he just looks after the contracts, right? So contract succession planning. And even though, they have a lot of talent, who would be highly sought after elsewhere, they very rarely lose someone that they want to keep, okay? And there's very rarely any nonsense in the press about, so-and-so demands is about to walk. It's done quietly. It's done in a nice, steady way without affecting players' performances, and it's all put to bed. They regularly announce 25 signings, on one day, which have been done over 3 or 4 months. So the contractual part of it seems to be a lot smoother than it is in other provinces, and they have a guy responsible for that. And then obviously there's someone like Leo who's there to think big picture and to be the gap between the academy and the senior team. And then you have Stuart who looks after the rugby side of it. So I think, look, I know they have the best resources, but also they have seemed to create a system that works well for them. And also the sub academy, I think they're the only province who have a sub academy where they can spend an extra year testing players to see if they're going to step up. So they make a decision at 20, whereas everyone else has to make a decision at 18, and that's obviously an advantage to them. But they put that in place. So I would say that, yeah, I think in fairness, Tim Owen looks after the negotiations in Connacht. Bryn Cunningham and John Petrie do it in Ulster, and and obviously now we're not really 100% sure who does it. We don't need to know. It needs to basically make sense financially that they spend the money they have wisely, and they have a very strong succession plan.
And Donal, goes back to what you were saying last week as well. I guess, some of the problems highlighted behind the scenes at Munster. You have the two forms of the branch between Cork and Limerick, really the split in the base. It does seem like, structurally, Munster could do an awful lot better to get their house in order, if you follow me, without being disrespectful.
Yeah, well, you see, they had the director of rugby structure there with Rassie Erasmus. That was his job. He was director of rugby. Jackman underneath him was really, who is now the South African head coach. He was the coach underneath him. Anthony Foley, Lord rest him, had gone back to being the forwards coach at that stage, and he was back sort of doing what he did best. So that, and Rassie was the guy who was doing all the recruitment, who was doing all the contracts and all that. So he had that holistic view. There was a view in Munster that I would have supported a number of years ago, when Declan Kidney finished with Ireland, that Munster should have brought him back in as a director of rugby, overseeing all that. I mean, Declan's, by his own admission, he was never the most innovative coach, but he was a brilliant man manager. And, I know the players over the years would have gone to Declan and say, look, our attack is crap. We need, when Tony McGahan was there, it was the players' demand that Tony McGahan be given an increased role, let's say, around the attacking elements. Declan had the capacity to step back and accept that and look at the wider picture. I think Kidney would have been a brilliant director of rugby for Munster because he knows the school system inside out, remember. He was an Irish schools coach. He was Pres coach that won a number of schools cup. So he was well got in that area as well. He would have come back from Ireland as a Grand Slam winning coach. So he would have been the ideal guy. But Munster just couldn't grasp it at the time. They lost an opportunity there, in my view. Then, when Rassie went back to South Africa, I think because of financial issues, they didn't replace him with a director of rugby. Johan van Graan came in, but in effect, he was half head coach and half director of rugby. And then Gareth Fitzgerald, Lord rest him, got ill, and that whole area has fallen down. So Wes is right. There's a total void there. So that's at the top of the professional level. And then there are issues underneath which have to be addressed as well. So look, it's not a short-term fix, but I think Munster, they were going down the right road when they had Erasmus in that position, but they sort of missed a trick that they didn't replace a like with like when he went back to South Africa.
Did you say, Wes, that Stephen Larkham is thinking about leaving?
Yeah, well, that's the story that emerged yesterday, that he's a year left in the contract, but there's potentially interest from the Waratahs. I heard it yesterday afternoon off someone, and then I saw it in the Irish Independent, I think, last night. Look, it adds to a perception of a bit of turmoil in light of recent events, but if he leaves, you know what I mean? Would be my take on it, to be honest with you. I don't think maybe we've seen what we thought we'd see from him. I think there's two excellent candidates that have come up through the province who probably aren't going to be interested in an assistant coach's role. In the obvious one everyone will mention is Raj, but I think Mike Prendergast would be a fantastic addition as well. I would say run.
Some interview Rog gave on Friday night, Wes, wasn't it? Like after the La Rochelle game. I mean, how many retweets, whatever. And just because he was so matter of fact and frank and honest and brilliant.
Good at dealing with the Fijians coming back late.
The
40 grand a month probably doesn't help with that at all with the Fijians, in fairness, salary. But you know, like I would say in a pandemic with the financial constraints that are there, we've seen the IRFU cutting more non-playing staff this morning. As a PR story and because of the financial benefits of it, if Stephen Larkham leaves, I would bet you Noel McNamara will become the backs coach in Munster.
Really?
It makes sense. They'll trumpet it as someone that came through the system. They won't have to pay him as much as someone like Stephen Larkham. It would be someone of that profile rather than another person like Stephen Larkham.
Donald, do you know when we've been talking about Munster's identity, right? You know, the issue of identity now in respect of the team that won the 2 Heineken Cups, the team with Donal Lenihan, Raj, Paul O'Connell, all the great Munster players, David Wallace of the years, and identity, and Munster knew what they stood for, and they were a world-renowned, recognised brand. And I'm looking at Paul O'Connell and the job he's done in a very short space of time with the Irish squad in terms of the line out in the forwards. I'm looking at Ronan O'Gara, who's producing some brilliant rugby and is now a seasoned, worldwide experienced coach, and Mike Prendergast. They're 3 guys who know exactly what Munster identity is, who know exactly what it is to play for Munster, and are coaching at the very top level. I mean, I was thinking to myself, Christ, imagine if Munster had those 3 guys move in as their new coaching ticket now, and what they could do and what they could achieve for Irish rugby and for Munster rugby.
That's the golden ticket, but it's also the easy solution. I mean, I remember Cork a number of years ago, I think, was it Jimmy Barry Murphy, Tom Cashman and Tony O'Sullivan they brought in as this, you know, the dream team. But, you know, it doesn't always work like that. The bottom line is you could have Graham Henry, Steve Hansen, Razzie Erasmus, put them all in there. Unless you get the foundations right and unless you get the pathways working towards the top team, it's not going to change. And O'Gara knows that better than ever. I mean, you know, we've spoken about him on this program before, and you know, I think there's a guy who has taken the hard route. He could have been involved with Munster years ago if he wanted to, but no. I mean, he's gone away. He's educating himself. He's exposing himself to different experiences. Ronan O'Gara will come back to Ireland when it's the right time for Ronan O'Gara to do so. Not because Munster have a crisis here or now, or not because there's a vacancy within the Irish setup or in Leinster or whatever. He will pick his moment. I hadn't seen a whole lot of La Rochelle this year because obviously we don't see the top 14 isn't on Sky anymore. But I mean, just you could see O'Gara's stamp all over La Rochelle on Friday night. They had the brilliance. They had the individual brilliance. They had guys who can offload, brilliant support lines, brilliant running lines. But you talk about pragmatism. Somebody mentioned pragmatism there earlier. I mean, I just wrote it down on the basis. I thought La Rochelle were brilliantly pragmatic. They managed the game well. They kicked when they needed to. They shut the game down when they needed to. I mean, when you looked at it, that's not a brilliant Gloucester team. And they didn't put them away. So, you know, I'm not quite sure what level they're at. Are they good enough to win a Champions Cup? Maybe, maybe not. But of more importance is I think you could see O'Gara's stamp all over that team. And he will come back to Ireland. There's no question about that. But he'll come back for the right job for him, number one. And secondly, from my own conversations with him over the years, it's clear to me he's not obsessed by titles. So if he thinks his best role is if what he does best is as a backs coach, and if that doesn't mean he's the head coach and he's labelled assistant coach, then, you know, so be it. But you see, people forget in La Rochelle, John O'Gibbs is in there as director of rugby. So I can imagine he's taking a lot of the peripheral stuff, I would imagine, away from Ronan. So again, it's about getting the setup within your own club right. There's no question he's done a brilliant job. There's no question Paul O'Connell has done a fantastic job with the Irish forwards. But that doesn't mean you lob them back into Munster overnight and all of a sudden, hey presto, all the problems are solved. Unfortunately, it doesn't work like that.
Look, we don't have a lot of time left, so Fiona, I want to talk about the Six Nations and Ireland kicking off their campaign against Wales this weekend. I have to say, look, in one respect, obviously, it's great that the championship is going ahead, given that it was cancelled because of the pandemic. But I watched the highlights of the England game and watched a good bit of the France annihilation of Wales at the weekend, and I was scratching my head and was going to myself, like, we're trying to promote the game of women's rugby in this country and certainly around the Six Nations Championship as well. But what's the point if England are going to go out and absolutely annihilate Scotland? And they did so without everyone coming out of third gear. France go out and they annihilate Wales again this weekend. And I'm kind of saying to myself, well, what's the point in all this? Like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, look, I do believe the games need to be more competitive. How we make them more competitive, again, is back to that long-term plan and where we're at. Like, England are fully professional, France are semi-professional, but this has been a problem for a number of years, not just since England have gone professional. Yes, they've more numbers in, their structures are way better from the academy, they've under-20s, and they've coaches at every level as well. And I suppose that's where the other countries need to get to. With France, there's still that level of inconsistency, like they drew with Scotland last year. But when you see the form that they were in last weekend against Wales, you just think it's ominous of where it's going. And you can't see anything bar France, England in that 1-2 playoff. And it's just where Ireland sit next. I think Ireland certainly should aim to be best of the rest, and that they should be pushing for that third place finish. They've spoken a lot about the amount of training they've had. They've had 20 camps and there's 3-day camps. So that's great, but we haven't seen them play since last October. Yes, we saw an improvement last year in 2020. It's whether they continue that and keep improving, whether they're actually going to put a dent at all in playing against England or France, because France are in their pool. So,
and I saw even McDermott as well. I mean, not to pick up on this, and I don't know to highlight. She was quoted this week as saying, "Look, she's confident that Ireland can cause upsets against the big team." And I was kind of saying to myself, right, is that just confidence speak because they have to think like that, however unrealistic it is, or is it realistic that Ireland can actually go and beat France or England this year?
If France don't turn up, it's always there. As I said, they drew with Scotland last year, but no, they're operating on a different level. Like, if you saw from set piece, there's an attacking game plan, and France's defence was outstanding last week. It's probably the best that I've ever seen it. But on the flip side, that Wales were so disappointing. Like, they've had their own upheaval. They've had a new coach who's only in 4 months. They lost their skills coach, Rachel Taylor, there about a month ago. But all these players are playing Premiership rugby week in, week out, and you just didn't see it on the pitch at all. And they were really, really poor. It's whether they can turn anything around in a week to see them improve. But based on last year's results and performance, I would say Ireland will do very well against them.
Yeah, and that was a French team as well, without Menagerie in the back row. Sophie Ndiaye didn't start as well. You know, there was a couple of players I wasn't overly familiar with, but they seem to be bringing through an awful lot of young, talented players. The likes of those, if you like, French women legends over the last few years can't get near the team at the moment, which I think speaks volumes for the strength and depth they're producing as well.
Yeah, and again, back to that structure, you know, their clubs are really strong. They've been playing their club competitions, and they have a really strong sevens program as well, and that's completely separate now. That's where Menagerie is, and Corson is. She's injured, so they're away at the moment. So this is very much a 15 squad for the Six Nations. I'm probably looking towards the World Cup as well. But yeah, there was lots of new players in there. Even Pernaud playing at 10. I haven't seen a huge amount of her at 10. Grow playing at 8. Again, haven't seen a huge amount of her, and they were phenomenal. So they definitely have the player base there that probably Ireland doesn't have. But I don't know how we're going to close that gap again. I think it's back to those structures. Like, if you think about it, we have no schoolgirls rugby here. We've no under-20s rugby here.
No.
We're relying on an AIL that probably hasn't been the standard that it's should be at. The RFU have certainly invested in it. It was supposed to be this year where they were looking to invest fully in it, but we obviously COVID, we didn't see that. And then the Interpros, I don't think serve their purpose, that it's that step up between club to international. The gap is still too big.
Is it an awful pity though, Fiona? I mean, I must say, I was looking for the fixtures of the weekend, you know, at a time when the Women's Six Nations is now standalone. Obviously, it was running parallel with the under-20s and the Senior Six Nations for so long. They get their own slot, which looked brilliant. And all of a sudden then I see Ireland are playing at the same time as Leinster and Exeter. It's just unfortunate, really, because, you know, I think if you had that slot on your own, you'd attract a big audience. But, you know, Leinster, Exeter, quarterfinal of the Champions Cup, it's a pity.
Yeah, the only benefit is it's that the women's game is on free to air, so hopefully we'll get eyes on it in the sense of, you know, people that wouldn't necessarily have BT watch Champions Cup. But yeah, look, I'm a fan of moving it away from the men's Six Nations to its own slot. But when you're up against Champions Cup, it's always going to be difficult to get that, I suppose, exposure and visibility that the game needs.
So we won't do any prep, is what you're saying, because nobody will be watching Fiona this weekend, huh?
No, it's on RTÉ. There'll be loads watching.
Okay, listen, lads, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for your time to Fiona as well. Ireland taking on Wales this weekend live on RTÉ television as well. Leinster take on Exeter, as we mentioned, and we'll review the game next week. To Wes, to Bernard, Donal and Fiona, thank you so much. We'll talk to you next week.